Hi everyone, my name's Katherine, and I'm going to be providing an existential view of King Lear. And this is achieved through the critic James Baker, who wrote an essay called An Existential Examination of King Lear, which is a great essay that you should have a look at if you have the time to, because it will explain things maybe in more detail than I can right now. But this read of the text was achieved through reading his essay. So existentialism as a concept is a philosophical idea, and it's this idea that the human condition, so who we are as people, is disordered, and love provides us with a human but ephemeral illusion of order. Or that's how Shakespeare views it. Existentialism as a philosophy is this idea that life is meaningless and we each have the freedom and drive to seek out a purpose. So we all have a responsibility for our own actions as well, and we all have our own innate drive to seek out a meaning in this life that is ultimately meaningless. So within existentialism are a few other theories that you may have learned already or that you may learn at another point in your English studies, but there are things like nihilism, which is the most depressing form, essentially, which basically means that life is meaningless, and so there's no point whatsoever, no point in finding a purpose, no point in anything, really. And then there's things like absurdism. So that was pioneered by Albert Camus. And he basically said that the world is just completely weird, and so we have to find our own meanings to define the absurdity or the weirdness. But this critic, James Baker, basically says that to be an authentic person is to be one who faces the human condition, resolutely accepts his finitude and his death, creatively responds to life, and manfully assumes responsibility for all of his decisions. So he really looks at this text through the lens of authenticity. What does it mean to be an authentic person? What does it mean to be a human in a world that is completely disordered, in a world that just doesn't make sense whatsoever? And all of these themes related to King Lear relate to the idea of disorder. Something has gone wrong. Some sort of order has been disrupted. And in Shakespearean time periods, they don't like the idea of order being disrupted, because if order has been disrupted, then God has been challenged, and that's not okay. So we can't also call King Lear existential. And I know that sounds ridiculous because I'm calling it existential, but we can say that we're applying an existential philosophy to King Lear, or we can call it quasi-existential, but we can't say that it is existential, because that would be anachronistic, which basically means that existentialism didn't exist during Shakespeare's time period. The philosophy hadn't been invented yet. So if we said that Shakespeare was an existentialist, it doesn't make sense, because he wouldn't have known what that was. Existentialism was invented many, many years after Shakespeare. Same thing as well, we can't call Shakespeare a feminist, or we can't say that he has feminist ideas. We can say quasi-feminist, but not feminist itself. It feels like semantics, but it is a real thing that you need to take into account. So don't call it an existentialist play. Say it has existential notions or ideas within it. In terms of historical context for this, though, we've got the idea of the Renaissance, so the rebirth of classical notions into the culture. So high forms of art and philosophy are becoming more and more prevalent. We're into people like Aristotle and Socrates again. We like ancient Greek myth and all of those things. So as a result, humanism becomes a really big thing. And humanism is the philosophical approach centered on human value and potential. It's this idea that a god is not needed because humans can do it all. And so many of Shakespeare's kind of tragic heroes look at this idea of a secular humanist. Not Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, who was Shakespeare's biggest rival at the time, wrote a play called Dr. Faustus, and Dr. Faustus was a secular humanist to the greatest extent, and he essentially sells his soul for everlasting knowledge, but he ends up being dragged off to hell, because in a Christian paradigm, when writing underneath this Christian pattern of thinking, he can't just sell his soul to the devil and get away with it. Because Christianity is the big big doctrine that we're sitting underneath at this time period. So Shakespeare himself is a Christian humanist, basically saying that yes, humans can do so many things, but they can do it because God has given them the potential to. And every human has innate value, but that's because God has given them that value. So a little bit different. King Lear, though, uses the Christian paradigm to demonstrate the self-defeating nature of evil. So the idea that evil corrupts yourself, and also the purity of love. So this critic, Baker, says that the supreme virtue of the play is love. So it condemns evil. It says evil destroys the self, and love restores it. So he basically says, paraphrased, that existentialism is foregrounded in the possibility of transcendence from the space-time limitations it describes. Space-time just meaning that we are on this earth for a limited amount of time, and we can only go a limited amount of places in our life because of the time constraints that we have, but also just general constraints as well. We can't be everywhere. We can't all go to the moon and things like that. But he says that through this existential philosophy, these space-time limitations can be overcome through art, love, or religion. And this is what many existentialists argue. But Shakespeare advocates that love and religion, which may be viewed as the same thing, will provide that form of transcendence. So this idea that love and religion are the same thing because God is love. And because he is writing for a Protestant king, King James, he has to advocate for that. And also he might have believed it himself. But it's this idea that Christian humanism and Christian love transcends human space-time limitations. Love should be the thing that saves. But of course, in this context, it's metaphorically saves. So in another video, I talked about how he's cured of his blindness because he is able to see the reality of true Christian love. But in this case, he does end up dying because he is a human. He's limited to space-time limitations. However, he experiences a form of transcendence in the love that he ultimately feels from Cordelia and the love that he is ultimately able to give to Cordelia, despite the fact that she dies. So Lear is educated on humanity. He gains empathy and therefore essentially undergoes an existential awakening. So an existential awakening is the idea that he realizes that life is meaningless and that love is the supreme virtue that is going to get him through. And we can also view that as this idea that he discovers God in a way. We can't actually say that because he doesn't say, I've discovered God or something, but he discovers what real love is, and that real love is God. So in terms of a structure of an argument, first off, he must unlearn court flattery. So he says, they told me I was everything, 'tis a lie, I am not ague-proof. So it's this idea that the court has constantly flattered him throughout his life, made him feel like he is better than he actually is, given him a massive ego. And in order to be a good Christian and assume the love that he needs to assume, he needs to unlearn this egotistical way of looking at the world. And that's what he's saying there in that quote. He then begins to develop concern for others. He says, poor naked wretches in the storm, when he is thinking about people who aren't living in the high courts for the first time in his life, it seems. And through that, he learns the fundamentals of the human condition. So he says, unaccommodated man is no more but such a poor barefoot animal as thou art. So a man without a home is a bare animal, a bare, sad animal, essentially. And he's saying, I am now one of those two, because he's out in the storm by himself. And in doing this, he ceases to give in to this performativity from up here, and that's achieved through immense suffering. As a result, he begins to see the injustice of the social order in the storm. So every time he sees and interacts with poor Tom, and he realizes how he's mistreated Cordelia, so punished her for her supposed rejection of order despite her being a good Christian. If you're interested in that idea, have a look at the video on women, because that explains that a whole lot more. And then as a result, he is spiritually and empathetically reborn prior to his death. which is this idea of an existential awakening. He wants nothing from life except to be with Cordelia, and so he gains humility, which is a big contrast to his character at the start of the play, who is the opposite of humble, very egotistical. So in this final quote, he says, "Come, let's away to prison. We two will sing like birds in the cage. When thou dost ask me blessing, I'll kneel down and ask of thee forgiveness." So that's pretty amazing. It's basically saying that he will kneel before this woman, which inversion of order again, but anyway. And he will ask for her forgiveness, beg at her knees for forgiveness. So again, she's kind of become this Christ-like figure, and he's repenting before her. And so he has finally understood what it is to assume this Christian humanistic love, where he is able to bow down to somebody before him who is maybe lesser than him, according to the time period, and ask of forgiveness. So he's learned to humble himself, essentially. So the key takeaway from this is basically this idea that within King Lear, he discovers that life is meaningless. Life is a collection of immense suffering, and the only thing that will provide you with any sort of redemption from this suffering is love. And he is finally able to feel that love just prior to his death. And Cordelia helps him do that. So she acts as this almost redemptive figure, or this form of salvation for him, because she shows him what true love actually is, and that is achieved through Christian humanistic principles. Thank you. I hope that helps.